Thank you for that reading, Danny. Good morning again. So I did want to say, some of you have come this morning to celebrate with your families who are dedicating their kids. And if you were here to support some family members, would you just raise your hand so we can say hello to you? And yeah. So we are very glad to have you with us. And if you are new, we have been in a series together, walking verse by verse, chapter by chapter, through the Gospel of Mark. It's called A Year with Jesus. And what we're doing is we are taking an entire year to spend a year with Jesus, with the hope that by spending a year with Jesus, we might more deeply cultivate a life with Jesus. And I want to begin today like this. So there's a classic scene in the film-adapted version of J.R.R. Tolkien's classic, The Lord of the Rings, where Lord Elrond calls together this council of Middle-earth. And at the council meeting, representatives from Middle-earth are there, and they are there in order to discuss what is to be the fate of the Ring of Power. And after much debate, it's decided that the Ring of Power must pass through the dark, evil valley of Mordor and be taken to be thrown into the fires of Mount Doom. And the only question that remains is who will take the Ring of Power to the fires of Mount Doom? And everybody is quiet, everyone's silent because nobody wants this job. But then little Frodo stands up. He's a little hobbit, if you're unfamiliar. And he says, "I will go, but I do not know the way." And then Gandalf stands up, Gandalf the wizard, he says, "I will help you bear this burden." And then Lord Aragorn stands up and says, "You have my sword." And then Gimli the dwarf says, "And my axe," And Legolas the elf says, "And my bow," And then Sam, of course, his companion, runs alongside. He won't be left behind. And then standing in the corners, in addition to the six that have joined Frodo, are his other two friends, Merry and Pippin. And they run off and they said, "You can't leave without us, we're going with you, we will go with you, And then Pippin says, "After all, you need some people of intelligence on this quest, mission thing, And then, are you guys doing okay with this? It's a lengthy illustration. And then Elrond says, "9 companions, you shall be the fellowship of the ring." And then Pippin speaks up. He says, "Right, where are we going?" And it struck me. I was thinking about that text that scene this week when I was studying the text we're looking at today, because in our passage, it's almost as if the disciples are in the space of Pippin. They have devoted themselves to follow Jesus wherever he goes, but up to this point, they really don't know where he's going. They're like, where's he going anyway? And we saw last week that Jesus clarified where he is going. He took them up to Caesarea Philippi in the north, and he made clear that he would be taken he would go into Jerusalem, and there in Jerusalem, he would be betrayed, he would be handed over to the Roman authorities, and he would be executed on a cross. And they had no idea that this is where this whole thing was going. And yet they are there with Jesus. And they had known, of course, the Messiah is going to go to Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the capital. If you were going to be the Messianic king, of course, at some point, you would have to go to the capital. But they were thinking, you go to the capital, you marshal together the troops, you gather the tanks and the bombs, and you go and you shock and awe the occupying power of Rome, and you establish God's kingdom right in the middle of the earth, and you overthrow the Romans, and you establish, a messianic kingdom. This is what they were hoping for. But Jesus says, "No, I'm not going to Rome to kill my enemies. I'm going to Rome to lay down my life on behalf of my enemies." But he presses it further for the disciples and for us. And in some ways, it gets worse. Because after telling the disciples, putting them on notice, to their absolute shock, it's outrageous, the idea that the Messianic king would go to Jerusalem and be crucified. But then he makes matters worse, and he turns to them, and he turns to all of us, and he says this, calling the crowd to him with his disciples, he said to them, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up the cross, and follow me." He says, if anyone. Jesus makes this call, or rather this invitation, as wide-reaching as possible. He calls the crowds to him and his disciples to him. And then he says, if anyone will follow me. In other words, this is the basic requirements of discipleship to Jesus. It's this: if you would come after me, says Jesus, deny yourself, take up the cross, and follow me. Now, I just want to stand back, and I want to make three simple observations about what Jesus says in our text. Number one is this: Jesus' call, or his invitation, is radically countercultural and counterintuitive. I mean, nobody was expecting to hear this. Again, the disciples wanted to go down into Jerusalem with Jesus and be a part of his security council. You know, be the vice president, secretary of state, have some high cabinet position. But Jesus says, no, if you come with me, you are going to have to deny yourself and bear a cross. And this is radically countercultural for them. And of course, it is a countercultural call for us. It runs against the grain of our fundamental selves, because Jesus says, look, if you are going to follow me, you need to deny yourself. And again, I mean, this is completely out of step with American culture. I went to my daughter's graduation ceremony this week. Anybody here go to a graduation ceremony this week for anybody? Yeah. And, you hear some speeches, right? And I think one of the best all-time speeches given to a graduation class came from the Gen X author David Foster Wallace to the graduating class at Kenyon College. And this brilliant, kind of more secular-leaning author, he basically chooses as his theme for this graduating class of more affluent and privileged young adults the theme of selfishness. And he essentially challenges them, and I think us all, about what he calls our default mode. And the default mode, he said, is this, quote, "It is the automatic, unconscious belief that I am at the center of the world, and that my immediate needs and feelings are what should determine the world's priorities." And Foster Wallace says that is our default mode. We are at the center of our world. And of course, in that speech, he was naming basically what is core to, I think, a lot of us, which is narcissism and self-absorption. Now, I don't want to be too harsh on you all. I'll just include myself in this. We all have a tendency toward narcissism and self-absorption. Now, I know that various times at various places throughout human history, people, of course, have been marked by narcissism, self-absorption. In fact, all the way back in the 4th century, Augustine described the human condition as, with a Latin phrase, incurvatus in se, which means a heart curved in on itself. And then in the 16th century, John Calvin said that the basic problem for us humans is, quote, distorted self-love. And so, of course, every culture and every people has had something of hearts turned in on themselves, have been self-obsessed. But wouldn't you agree that we Americans have perfected the art of narcissism and self-absorption? There was a limerick that said, "There once was a nymph named Narcissus who thought himself very delicious. So he stared like a fool at his face in a pool, and his folly today is still with us." Except we don't look at ourselves in a pool. Instead, we take selfies. And we take not one, but multiple selfies, and then we sift through the selfies. We pick the best, then we carefully edit the photo and post it on social media to get likes. I read a study in the Huffington Post a while back that linked selfies to narcissism and psychopathy. They did clarify that if you edited a photo, you're probably a narcissist, but not a psychopath, because they said a psychopath lacks impulse control and just posts the photo, which makes sense because I never edit photos of myself. Now, of course, selfies are low-hanging fruit, but I think we'd all agree that our problem with narcissism and self-absorption, it runs deep. A while back, I read a book by an editor or group of writers called The Self Beyond the Postmodern Crisis. They were psychotherapists, psychologists from New York University and whatnot. And what they argue in this book is that for much of world history, our identity has been formed by a matrix of family, religion, and community. For most of human history, if you were asking, who am I? You would answer that by drawing upon your family and your tradition and your culture and your religion and narratives you learned. But they said that in our current cultural moments, that has all been deconstructed so that now people are left to themselves to develop their own identity. It's no longer conferred upon you. Instead, you have to build your own identity and then present it to other people. And he says, in the book, asks the question, well, how do we build and construct identities? And the book argues it's through our consumptive activities. We shop, we purchase, and then we put on display our purchases in order to create an identity. Now, that was 20 years ago. I think you could add to our consumptive activities, oftentimes our political ideologies. That's another thing we look to build our identity and to make us know who we are. But this all, this kind of like building your own identity on your resume and what you've done and what you've purchased and the car you drive, it all creates, I think, real anxiety for a lot of us because you walk into a space like this and you're constantly wondering, how did you present? And I don't know if you've ever felt this. You walk in and you're feeling you didn't like what you wore, and you're constantly wondering, like, what did they think about me? Or you're in a conversation and you said something maybe a little awkward, and you're like, oh, what did they think about me? And of course, the honest answer is they aren't thinking about you. They're thinking about themselves and how they were presenting to you. But, think about, in our culture, our own ability to gratify our own desires and to surround ourselves with luxury and comfort. I mean, unlike any other time in the history of the world. It used to be that if you wanted something salty and fatty, it required you to go boar hunting or something like that. And that demanded a certain hard work and delayed gratification, But now it's like you just go to In-N-Out and some nice young person in a little hat comes to you and asks you what you want, and then before you know it, you got a burger animal style and French fries and a chocolate milkshake. and of course, in our culture, self-absorption doesn't just get reflected in self-indulgence. Oftentimes, the disciplines we embrace, sure, we can discipline ourselves, we can deny ourselves, but oftentimes our self-denial is actually in the service of self. And so we embrace diets and exercise regimes. Oftentimes, it's for your own personal health, that's all good. But oftentimes it's because, the summer's approaching, I want to present a certain way, And oftentimes, the discipline and hard work and education, it's going to serve, ultimately a job we get so that we can earn a lot of money, we can have an impressive resume, and we can build our own status and identity. But the point is that we live in a world that it habituates us to be very self-centered, self-absorbed people. And so Jesus comes on the scene, and he says, if you're going to follow me, number one base level requirement and demand is that you not feed and, kind of like nourish your own self-absorption. Instead, Jesus says, basic requirement is that you deny yourself. And so, first observation, Jesus' call or his invitation here, it runs against our cultural sensibilities and in the world we inhabit. Number two, I want you to see that Jesus' invitation to come and deny ourselves and follow him, secondly, it's connected to the cross. Notice what he says. He says, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Now, it's easy for us to think about the cross as a religious symbol. You know, it adorns our churches. We wear it around our necks. Edgy Gen X pastors get it tattooed on their forearm. And, and so we think, oh, it's a religious symbol, a cross and spirituality and all that stuff. It's all connected, But, in the ancient world, in the world of Jesus, the cross had only one meaning. Sometimes we come into the Bible to words and they have a wide semantic range. There's a broad array of meanings associated with one word. This is not one of those instances. When the first century hearers heard about a cross, only one thing came to mind. It was a literal crucifixion. And everybody around Jesus had seen crucifixions. Crucifixion was incredibly common in the first century. It was a horrible instrument of execution devised by the occupying power to inflict the most degrading death upon slaves and rebels and to inflict psychological torment that would control the population. And Jesus says to us all, he says, if you want to follow me, deny yourself and take up the cross and follow me. And in this context, what Jesus says could only mean one thing. He is inviting his disciples, he is inviting us all to renounce violence and to embrace martyrdom. He says, follow me to Jerusalem, renounce violence, embrace martyrdom. I was reading a couple years ago a book by a theologian named James Cone. And in this book, he does something interesting. He's writing back a few decades ago, and he's reflecting on the comparison between the role that lynchings played as vigilante justice to instill terror in the population and the role that crucifixions played, their kind of connection in the ancient world. He wants to tie these two things together. And in the course of this book, he makes this interesting observation. He talks about two public intellectuals or two public theologians in the middle of the 20th century in America. The first he discusses is Reinhold Niebuhr, and some of you might know this name. He was a very prominent theologian, intellectual. And he said that he contrasts him with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And he said the difference between Dr. King and Reinhold Niebuhr, among other things, he said Reinhold Niebuhr, he says, analyzed the cross in his theology. And he drew upon the Son of Man in Ezekiel and the suffering servant in Isaiah. And he did so more clearly and persuasively than almost any other white American theologian in the 20th century. But then he contrasts that with Dr. King, and he says this. He says, Dr. King did not just talk about the cross, but he lived the meaning of the cross. And he put it like this. He said, it's one thing to teach theology in the safe environs of a classroom, and quite another to live one's theology in a situation that entails the risk of one's life. What Jesus invites disciples into, yet we are invited into a theology classroom. You are invited to reflect theologically on the cross of Jesus. In many ways, it feeds the soul to reflect upon Christ and what he has done on the cross and all of its varied and many meanings. And in the weeks ahead, when we get further into chapters 13 and 14 and 15 in the Gospel of Mark, we are going to plumb some of the depths of the mystery of the cross of Jesus. But what he's saying is that the cross is not simply a theological idea to reflect on. It is a way of life to embrace for a follower of Jesus. It is quite one thing to teach theology or to think about theology in the safe environs of a classroom, and quite another to live one's theology in a situation that entails the risk of one's life. On the other side of the Atlantic in Germany, there was another young theologian around this same time. His name was Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer was also a brilliant mind and theologian, but he too, like Dr. King, didn't simply reflect upon the theological meaning of the cross. Dietrich Bonhoeffer embraced the way of the cross and would eventually die as a martyr under Hitler's Nazi Germany. And at one point in his book, The Cost of Discipleship, he has this very memorable line. He says, when Christ calls a man or woman, he bids them come and die. And so in our text, Jesus is not only speaking words and inviting us into a way of being that runs against, a fundamental aspect of American culture. Jesus is inviting us into a way of being that embraces the reality of the cross, the potential of martyrdom. Third observation about our text is that Jesus' invitation, at this point, especially if you've been invited by family members to come celebrate a child dedication, maybe you're not a real church-going person, and your family says, come, we're going to have a nice child dedication at church, And then you come here, and the pastor's up here talking about self-denial and bearing the cross. Welcome to church, You know what's interesting is Jesus says, paradoxically, this radically alternate way of being in this world, denying yourself, taking up your cross, is the way into real life. Look at how he puts it. He says, forever would save his life, would lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's sake will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his life? What can a man give in exchange for his soul or his life? Jesus is introducing to us a deep paradox of the Christian life. And it's a paradox that I think a lot of us have discovered in our own lives. That the way into genuine fullness and meaning and full, rich life is ironically and paradoxically by giving your life and sacrificing your life for others. We watch some parents dedicate their children, and of course, when a mom and a dad have a child, what is that? If you're doing it right, it's an invitation into self-denial and death to self, isn't it? I mean, there is some death involved in the work of parenting. And yet, there is also richness and fullness on the other side. And of course, most of us know this. If you embrace, sports and you want to be good at your craft, or you want to be a great, instrumentalist or something, and you through delayed gratification, through sacrificing things you want, you actually pursue something that on the far end of it, it contributes to wholeness and well-being. And Jesus is saying, look, this is a fundamental aspect of life in God's world. The way to find your life is to lose it for Jesus and for the gospel, to orient yourself around Jesus. And so Jesus says, look, come to me, and what I'm inviting you to do is deny yourself, take up the cross, and follow me. Now, what I want to do at this point is I want to stand back, and I want to just ask, what might this mean for us in 2024? In the ancient world, in the world of Jesus, to deny oneself and to take up the cross, it was real. And those words had real freight, because Mark was almost certainly writing this gospel to a group of Christians in Rome just at the outbreak of a Neronian persecution, right when Caesar Nero was persecuting Christians. And so when they heard these words, deny yourself, take up the cross, and follow me, they knew what it meant, and it was real, because their life were really under threat. But, let's be real. If you're gathered with us this morning in this nice, lovely church building, in this beautiful little community of Sierra Madre, it's likely the case that you left a comfortable bed this morning and you got into maybe a nice car that drove you here, and nobody was threatening to take your life, were they? And so what does it look like to deny ourselves and to follow Jesus in 2024? Well, let's first note what it doesn't mean. First, it doesn't mean neglect yourself. Deny yourself doesn't mean neglect yourself. Self-denial is not the same thing as self-neglect. You know, in our day and age, of course, there's a lot of talk about the need for self-care, and for good reason. You know, of course, many of you know if you don't care well for yourselves, you will have little left to care for others. It's difficult to have the resources you need and what you need to serve other people well if you're not caring well for yourself. So self-denial does not mean self-neglect. And look, let me just say this to some of you. You know, if you are going to be around for your grandchildren in the future, you might need to take better care of your bodies. You might need to eat healthier and exercise more. You know, for some of you, if you want to be patient with your children, you might need to turn off your devices at night and get more sleep so that you'll have more energy in the morning. If you are going to have a life with God, you probably need to deny yourself of some things and get away for a while and be alone with God. Take self-time with God in order to have more energy and fullness to give to other people. And so self-denial does not mean self-neglect. In fact, self-care can be a part of truly doing good work for others. Nor does it mean to hate yourself. You know, there's something to be said for healthy self-esteem and self-love. I mean, get this. You are the object of the love of the Creator of all things. And if God so loves you, then there is something right and good about also loving yourself. You're merely agreeing with God. And so love yourself well, care for yourself well. Self-denial does not mean self-hatred. It doesn't mean self-neglect. You're like, well, what does it mean? I think in short, it means this, at least two things. First, it means be willing to die for Jesus if necessary. Oscar Romero, the great martyr from the 20th century down in El Salvador, put it like this. He said, quote, "Those who follow Jesus must carry with them a similar readiness to give their life at all times. We must not love our lives so much that we avoid taking the risks in life that history calls for. Those who seek to shun danger will lose their lives, whereas those who love Christ, who for the love of Christ dedicate themselves to the service of others, will live." And Dr. King put it like this. He said, quote, "Taking up the cross is the voluntary or deliberate choice of putting ourselves without reservation at the service of Christ and his kingdom. It is putting your whole being in the struggle against evil, no matter what the cost." And so to deny ourselves and take up our cross, it means first to be willing to die for Christ if necessary. Now again, you know, I'll just say for myself, I don't feel afraid at this point in my life that I'm going to have to give my life because the government's going to kill me for my faith in Jesus. But it also means this. It means being willing to die to self for the sake of Christ. The way of Christian discipleship is to deny the primal but fallen instinct to prioritize our own security and our own self-interest above all else. And it is to resist that and reject that. Or put it like this. So many of us, we spend the good gifts that God has given to us building up our own identity, our own status through our purchases, through the things we're putting together. We're seeking to present ourselves well to other people, and we're just so concerned about self. And yet there is so little of what we have that is being sacrificed to give away in the service of Jesus and others. And if following Jesus in the way of the cross means anything, it means being willing to die to ourself for the sake of the gospel. Now, I was thinking about this week, and I was thinking about, this is so tricky because in our life with God, you know, it's easy to take good things and to do bad things with those good things. And so, for example, it's a good thing for me to get up and to study hard and to preach a sermon. But I can use this moment of preaching in order to further build up my own identity, make myself look good. That can be what my concern is, and that is a hellish concern. And of course, we can use our vocations in very good ways as a nurse or teacher or an entrepreneur or any number of things in order to serve other people well. God has called you and me to use our vocations in ways that honor and serve and care for other people very well. But we can use those same things simply to serve ourselves. And Jesus is saying, look, a fundamental aspect of Christian discipleship, the very base level ground, the very place we begin in our relationship with Jesus is to say, look, I am going to deny self. I'm going to deny my selfish desires, my need for revenge. I'm going to deny my need to look good, my need to present, my need to build status and identity. And instead, I am going to deny all of that so that I can pursue the beautiful, life-giving way of Jesus. And this is what we've been invited into. But here's the thing. Jesus says, this is where life is found. And I wonder, do we believe that? Do you believe that? Do I believe that? That it is in giving that we ultimately will be receiving. That it's by sacrificing that we actually find our life. That Jesus is not wrong. Jesus is, he is the smartest, wisest human being to ever live. And he's given us wisdom about life. He's saying, look, do you trust me? Come and follow my way of being. There is so much of a better way of being in this world than self-absorbed and self-focused and constant loops in your head about self and what people are thinking about you. Jesus is like, look, deny yourself, take up your cross, die to yourself, and come and follow me, and you will find life. And listen, this is not just the invitation of Jesus. This is what God in Jesus has done for humanity. Christ has given his own life so that he might purchase, so that he might redeem our lives from death and sin and darkness and hell. Jesus has come and he's given everything so that he might ultimately find life for us all. And he says, look, come and follow my way of being in this world, and you too will find life. Now, we're going to end here. But in the weeks ahead, we're going to further unpack what this looks like in different aspects of life. But let's close today with just prayer. Let's just ask that the Spirit of God would open up our eyes to pockets in our own life, in our own hearts, where, as we said last week, we might be blind to, that God would open up our eyes to what it looks like for us to walk faithfully in the way of discipleship. Let's pray together. Father, we ask that you, the one who knows us better than we know ourselves, that by your Spirit, that you would convict us of areas in our own life where we have gone way, way off the rails. And would you enable us by your Spirit to renew our commitment to you, to follow your Son Jesus wherever he leads us, to be devoted to his beautiful and life-giving and difficult way of being in this world. God, would you give us the strength to commit ourselves to your Son Jesus and to his way in this world? And would you help us as a community to support and nurture each other in our shared life of discipleship? And we ask this in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.